Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Adam Dorsay, a psychologist in Silicon Valley and the host of SuperPsyched, a podcast dedicated to supercharging your life. Each episode contains fun, high-quality interviews with experts looking at psychology from all angles. SuperPsyched is your tool to get more of what you want in your life and less of what you don't. As children, we all watched movies with romantic themes that promised that the couple lived happily ever after. But were those films a true reflection of reality? Did they portray couples navigating the tough challenges life threw their way, or did they simply suggest that love was enough to overcome all obstacles? From my perspective as a therapist, I've learned that a myriad of factors contributes to a healthy, lasting relationship. One of the most crucial being how couples communicate about real-life topics like money. I know. It's an uncomfortable topic. Many of us wish that discussions about finances could remain separate from the realm of love. However, avoiding these challenging conversations can undermine the foundation of a strong partnership. Openly addressing financial matters alongside other potentially awkward topics is vital for a thriving relationship. Fortunately, help is here. Dr. Myra Strober, a retired Stanford economics professor, and my guest, social innovation leader, Abby Davisson, co-authored a remarkable book titled Money and Love, a comprehensive guide to life's biggest decisions, balancing rationality and emotion, and navigating the independence of personal and financial choices. This insightful book has become required reading at one of the top business schools worldwide, Stanford's Graduate School of Business. And it has struck a chord with many readers, including Nike CEO John Donahue, as well as SuperPsyched guest, best-selling author, and poker champion Annie Duke, who described it as a brilliant framework for guiding tough conversations. So listen in as Abby discusses how to harmonize discussions about money and love. Abby Davisson, a hearty welcome to SuperPsyched.
Thank you so much, Adam. I'm so delighted to be here.
I loved your book and I love your work. And let's just first start off with, it's almost meme worthy. Love will cure all. What are your thoughts on that notion?
Some days, I think that the title of the book is Money and Love. So certainly I put love right up there. But I would say it's not a cure-all. I don't think there is a silver bullet in life. I think that there are multiple bottom lines that we're all solving for in order to be human. And Freud said that love and work are the cornerstones of our humanness. So love is in there, but so is purpose and work.
I love that. And I actually quote that in my book, The Love and Work. And I would say that if my office was a Family Feud game, our number one answer is love. Number two answer is work. And money and love are really important. And oftentimes people think that it's almost taboo to discuss money in the context of love. What would you say if somebody said, I see them as separate entities?
People say that all the time. And in fact, the conventional wisdom is that you should not mix them, right? So I definitely grew up with the message that when it comes to career issues, when it comes to financial issues, those are ones you should really think about with your head and analyze. And when it comes to relationship matters, that you should really follow your heart or your gut or other parts, right? You should not let your head get in the way. And it really was not until I took my co-author's course in graduate school that I realized that conventional wisdom is completely wrong and it steers us very much down the wrong path, that money and love very much need to be taken into consideration together when making big life decisions. And so ever since I had that light bulb moment in her class, I've been doing that and it really has changed my life for the better.
Interesting for me to hear you say this because I was talking with you offline about my own journey in terms of meeting my own wife and how at a particular birthday, just before I re-met my wife, I had written out a list because I wanted my brain to be the primary driver in determining who I would end up with. I wanted, of course, all my other body parts to agree. But what I noticed that I, not so different from so many people, allowed either sexual attraction or my heart to be the primary drivers, superseding and almost quieting the brain. And there would be non-starters in the relationship. And I would just say, you know what? I hope it'll change. But subsequently, I've learned that hope is not a strategy and it's merely a procrastination tactic. People do change, but not unless they really want to change. The old psychology joke is, how many psychologists does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer is one, but the light bulb has to want to change. Finding true motivation to change is a really big deal. And it usually has to be generated from within, not without. There was this great musical, I believe it was a play title, I love you, ... please change. And John Gottman has found that, and I believe you cited this in the book, that 69% of the problems that we have don't get solved throughout the course of our relationship. And the question is, which problems are okay and which problems maybe not okay? So let me ask you this, Abby. Based on your experience, what problems might allow a couple to go the distance in marriage versus some problems that might not go the distance?
No marriage is without problems. I've been married 15 years. My co-author had been married several times and is in a new relationship. And it's not to say that the perfect relationship is without problems. I think the perfect relationship is one where you can talk through those problems and are willing to confront those problems with your partner and not let them get in the way of finding a solution. And so the image that I love and that I have to use continuously for myself is thinking of me and my husband on the same side of the table against the problem, whatever that problem is, whether it's feeling financially strapped, whether it's someone feeling like they're doing more when it comes to the household and the family work. It's not that it's me versus him. It's us against the problem of someone feeling like this isn't fair, or like we're feeling like we don't have the financial flexibility to do something we want, right? And so it's the foundation of us being able to have those difficult conversations, again, which was planted in this class we both took with my co-author, that has enabled us to go the distance, I believe.
I love that. And I love the idea of us versus the problem and the two of you teaming up and saying, let's externalize this problem. All social psychological experiments predict that the best way for an alliance to be created is to have a common enemy, so to speak. And in this case, if you're able to externalize the problem and say, let's solve this together. AJ Jacobs, who's one of my very favorite people on the planet, he's been on the podcast 5 times. He wrote a book called The Puzzler. And he said, if we could just look at our problems as puzzles that need to be solved together, we would have a much greater success rate. And by the way, lest anybody who's listening think that Abby and I are perhaps suggesting that love is not important or that sexual attraction is not important. That is not what we are saying. Would you agree? Okay, yes.
Not at all. Yes.
Both of those are very, very important. And green lights have to be yielded by all organs, whether it's our heads, our hearts, our guts, or our nether regions. But I like the idea of asking yourself, does this logically make sense that we're together? You're talking about the ability to talk about hard things.
Yes, very much. Because even before you can externalize the problem or treat it as a puzzle, you need to be able to face it, right? You need to be able to talk about it. And I think I had relationships before my husband where I felt like it was not okay, or it would be tainting the relationship somehow to talk about money or to talk about career ambitions or to talk about some of these things that feel less than romantic. And I think that's where I got into trouble. And so just the ability to go there in terms of saying, hey, I'm feeling uncomfortable with this issue, or we haven't really discussed if we want kids, who's planning to be the primary caregiver, or if not, both of us want to continue to work, how are we going to solve that conundrum, right? If my husband and I both had mothers who either stepped out of the workforce or found a way to work and be the primary caregiver, I didn't want that in my relationship. But this was the first relationship where I felt I had permission to say that. And I give that credit a lot to my co-author, again, whose class we had these conversations because of.
I love that. This podcast has been quite diverse. We've had everybody on from Nobel laureates to people who are teenagers. In fact, a teenager who was on this podcast, I believe he's actually still a teenager. He's now at Stanford, but Zach Gottlieb, who's the son of Lori Gottlieb, he said that we can't fix what we don't talk about. Mm-hmm. He was only 16 when he said that on his website, Talk with Zach. Blew my mind. And yet, so many of us adults haven't really received the message that the 16-year-old was so beautifully able to articulate. In my office, people don't know how to speak about money as a second language with their spouse. It's very uncomfortable. They don't know how to talk about sex. They use euphemisms like down there and we were intimate and blah, blah, blah. They don't talk about things discreetly as if they were talking about a car part that needs to be dealt with, very specific. And one of your 5 C's, if you could just give an overview of one of the things that you and Myra talk about in your book are 5 C's. I'm not going to ask you to break them all down and give a master course on this podcast, but one of them is clarification. Is that correct?
Yeah. And the 5 C's is really a decision-making tool, right? Because so many of us get really stymied when it comes to making big life decisions, like who we should spend the rest of our lives with, but also like when it's time to move, or if we should accept a promotion or look for a new job. And so our research showed that one of the reasons that people are not great at making decisions is that we tend to make them too quickly. Mm-hmm. And so the 5 C's is really designed to help us slow down and to move from that emotional state so many of us find ourselves in when we are stressed about a big decision. And as you mentioned, the first of the 5 C's is to clarify what's important to you.
And I would think about clarification is we need to be really, really granular about what we talk about so that there's no ambiguity about what's being talked about, that we're talking about the same thing. Because so often, one of the things that happens is we think, based on our own subjective reality, that the other person must know what we're talking about, except for the fact that they are describing a different part of, for example, the elephant. If we were looking at the blind men metaphor of touching the elephant, the old ancient idea that 5 blind men, each touching the elephant, one touching the ear, saying it's like a pancake, and one touching the tail, saying it's like a rope, and blah, blah, blah. But we do that all the time in our conversations. And what would be your best advice to make sure that people are on the same page during the clarification stage?
It's interesting because the clarification stage is actually an internal one. Mm-hmm. It's not until we get to the second C, which is communication, that we then are trying to make sure we're communicating what's important to us to someone else, the other person that's involved in the big decision. And that clarification step is, I think, the hardest to do and the most important to get right, because as you mentioned, it's really hard to communicate to someone else what you think or what's important to you if you haven't taken that time and that self-reflection to say to yourself, okay, I'm going to tune out what my parents wanted for me, what my teachers wanted for me, what my grandparents wanted for me, and just tune in to what I care about. What is most important to me? Tuning out, again, what society wants us, what we're seeing on social media. It's really hard because of this phenomenon called mimetic desire, which is something that French philosopher René Girard coined to say, we want what other people want. And so if you're able to get really quiet and to tune into your values, tune into the things that really matter to you, that's when you can say, this is what I am solving for right now. And then once you have that clear picture, you can go to someone else and say, we've been talking around in circles about moving. And I just wanted to share with you something that I realized I've clarified for myself is important to me. And I want to see how that lands with you, right? So you're sharing your point of view in anticipation of then hearing their point of view. And so you'll appreciate this given what you do. So many of us think about communication as just the part that we say, but it's really also the part that we hear, and then our willingness to change our perspective based on what we hear, which is so rare, right? We just have a point of view and we share it and we expect someone to go along with it. But if you're in a long-term relationship with someone, it's so critical that the place you arrive, the solution to the problem that you're trying to solve together, is one that is acceptable to both of you. And the only way to do that is to make sure you understand what is acceptable to the other person.
I love that. And I was so delighted when you mentioned mimetic desire in the book and the attribution of that French philosopher. Just brilliant, so important, such a massive distractor from what we're trying to communicate to ourselves, let alone to the other. Because we think if other people want Diet Coke, we should want Diet Coke. I'm kind of joking when I say that, but that is just how it works for whatever it might be. And really spelunking within ourselves to figure out what is actually true and how do I communicate it to the other and how do I receive reciprocal communication from the other to ensure that an accurate communication has transpired. You and Myra are giving the world such a gift through this book and through your technology. This is such a big deal. One of the other things you talk about, and I've heard you talk about, is timing and knowing when to bring up perhaps a potentially important clarification leading up to communication. Can you talk a bit about timing?
Yes. And I've had to learn this the hard way, Adam, especially if you have young kids, if you're caregiving in any way, your time is really limited, right? And so you're sort of grabbing at any available moment to mention something important. And so one thing that you should not do, again, which is what I did for many years, which is bring up important topics right before bed, right? You're brushing your teeth with a partner and you're winding down and you say, oh, you know what? I forgot to mention that my boss told me about this new opportunity that would require us to move, but I'm really interested and I really want to go for it. Does that work?
The reason I'm laughing so hard is because, of course, I've done that.
Of course, we all have. That's the time.
It goes over like a lead balloon, but keep going.
Right. Or you're like rushing to get people out the door in the morning and you're like, okay, when I get back, remind me to tell you about this thing that my parents said that made me cry for hours, but I just want to mention it too. And you're like, wait, a huge part of communication is finding the right time to communicate. And we treat our work meetings so planfully and in such a sacrosanct way, right? Ask the person when is convenient for them. And then we set up a meeting on the calendar and we have a special link that we should go to. And then for our personal relationships, which many of us would say are more important to us than our work relationships, right? We are so haphazard with the way that we have these conversations. So we're just asking people to treat their personal relationships with a little bit more of the grace that you treat a relationship with a manager, for example, right? Where you say, I'd love to talk about this topic that's important to me. Let's figure out a good time to do that. Would Friday after dinner work for you? Should we actually make it a date and go out and talk about this? And so again, the hard way, I've learned over time to not bring up something when it's on the top of mind or when I have energy around it, but to sort of collect it throughout the week. And my husband and I have a practice of every Sunday, we have a meeting called TCOB, taking care of business. And it's on the calendar. And we both do the logistical blocking and tackling that you have to do when you have two kids that you are driving all over. But then we also say, are there any big topics that we should make time to talk about? And so, for example, right now we're thinking about a summer trip that we want to take. Travel is important to me. And now that we both own our own businesses, we have a little bit more flexibility about when we do it, but it's also really hard, right? Because we have a lot more responsibility. I'd like to say I'm the hardest boss I ever had, right? Because I'm very demanding of myself. And so we set aside time for those big topics when we bring them up on Sundays. It doesn't always mean we talk about it on Sunday, but we don't spring it on each other. And that's something that has, I think, been very helpful. And certainly we write about how that can be beneficial for conversations. And not only timing, but it's also place, right? There are certain conversations where it is better to be in nature or in a spacious place rather than having this conversation over piles of laundry or dirty dishes in your own home. And so it's really thinking carefully and being thoughtful about those particularities in addition to what you're going to communicate, which is kind of the default that all of us go to when we think about communication.
I love so many things about what you just said. I'm just going to go back in time to one of them, and that is the idea that we could just spring something on our partner, and we would never do that at work. It's considered sacrosanct, as you said, at work. We are very careful and conscientious there. And I would think that part of it is this fantasy that the other in our relationship is so close to us that they're almost an extension of ourselves. And we don't treat them with the same type of respect, and we need to, that we would treat a colleague at work. And some people might even say, my gosh, they do a TCOB meeting on Sundays, how unsexy. And I would say how actually very sexy. And here's why. It's because now there is a place for that, and there is a place for the other as well. There's a place for you two to be business partners in life, taking on the puzzles of the world together. And there's a place for the two of you to be romantic partners as well, to feed the relationship in that way. We would never just say, you know what, all you need to do is get rid of the weeds for a plant and it'll be fine. No, we know we need to water it. And we also need to put in fertilizer. And so much of what you and Myra have created is a system for both. And talking about money, talking about how logistically it's going to work out, that you get your vacation in, which is so crucial. You only get so many vacations in this lifetime. We think that life is kind of endless. No, it's not. We only have so many vacations, and so many vacations with our children. And here you are very conscientiously and strategically dealing with this to maximize your business world, which you said you have a very tough boss who is you. And there's a lot riding when you either show up or you don't make any money, and what that opportunity cost of time when you do take a vacation means. So really, really maximizing with your husband is a big deal. The other thing I'd like you to just shine a light on is you do talk about date night in your book and other things to keep the relationship nicely oiled, in addition to properly attending to the financial matters and having them talked about so there are no surprises, because surprises are very unsexy. What would you say would be some of your top tips about keeping the love part really well nurtured?
I love the way that you put it, which is that having a designated time to talk about the unsexy stuff, like who's doing pickup and drop off, not sexy. Totally agree. However, that means that when we do get time to ourselves, so for example, we were on vacation last week and we were in the mountains, and we had a day, my husband and I had a day while the kids were in ski school, and we had a snowshoe adventure together. And it means that on that snowshoe adventure, we can just talk about the big topics, about our dreams, about the things we're worried about, do a little bit of what would your ideal time on vacation look like, and not be like, oh, remember we forgot to talk about the pickup and drop off, because we have the designated time for that. So we get to have the kind of fantasy date because the logistics time slot is coming up on Sunday. So having that really frees you to have the romantic time just for the two of you. It's not every day that you're going to be in the mountains on vacation together, but having that designated time. I mean, I really believe that if something is on the calendar, it will be much more likely to happen than if it's, oh, someday we should do this. So my kids are now old enough that we can kind of leave them for a couple hours and go to a local restaurant or bar and they'll be okay. But for years before that was the case, we would block time and ask our babysitters in advance to make sure we had a couple of times on the calendar each month to just spend the two of us, where we were not down in the weeds. We were having our grown-up conversation with no food being flung anywhere that we weren't flinging, I guess. Because those are the types of things that if you're not planful about, and it's hard. Like I understand people who want to be spontaneous and they say, planning a date night weeks in advance, I don't want to do that. Well, the reality is when you have responsibilities, caregiving responsibilities or otherwise, spontaneity needs to be planned. I certainly, before I had kids, it was something I was worried about. Oh, I really value spontaneity and I really value just being able to like fly off at a moment's notice. But you know what's interesting, Adam? My husband, one of his values is stability and routines. And that was something that at first I was kind of like, oh, I don't know if we're compatible this way. But I think that we've found this middle ground where I can make sure we get a sitter, we make sure we put a time on the calendar, and then we can have a spontaneous adventure. It's not like you have to plan out every detail of that time. You just have to put the big rocks in place, if you will, so that you get that time. And then you can do what you want with it.
I love this. And this is so important. Esther Perel talks about the idea of a sex date. And people blanch when they hear that idea. Oh my God, it should be spontaneous. Folks, we're not in college anymore. We have responsibilities. We have diapers to change. We have in-laws to deal with and all kinds of things. So it's not the same. And you brought up that old maxim, if you fail to plan, plan to fail. It's just as simple as that. And yes, it does feel a little awkward for the first few minutes. Everyone who I've assigned a sex date to in my own practice has said, yeah, the first few minutes of transition feel a little odd. And then you find your way. But it's an insurance policy that it actually happens rather than it suddenly falling between the cracks. Because if there is something expendable, it will be that time. You will not have it otherwise. And I love the idea of knowing that you can have these snowshoe adventures where big ideas and big romance can transpire. I asked Pat Love, who wrote a book called Hot Monogamy. She's a great couple therapist and one of the great thought leaders. She said, do something novel with your partner. That is my top tip. There you are with your husband, the great logistician. By the way, I also married a similar, thank God, I married an air traffic controller who's brilliant. I know it's a term that's a loaded one at the moment, but I'm so grateful to have a wife who thinks logistically. And it's such a big deal because it does create time for all the things that constitute a real life with fewer surprises. And then I think about this idea that you have about maybe there are some conversations that should happen in the woods because they might be, I'm just intuiting that they might be big ideas that need big spaces, that maybe small spaces and with tiny 8-foot ceilings might not be big enough to talk about these expansive ideas where we need to think outside the box. Can you say something more about talking in the context of a forest or one of these big spaces? What type of conversations would you want to have, and what would be some of the benefits of doing so?
Yeah, well, there's actually so much research around how our nervous systems are affected positively when we are in nature, right? When we're in trees or we can see water, there's a calming effect, right? I live right near open space preserve that UCSF actually assigns patients to go forest bathing as part of their recovery and their therapy as they're recuperating from surgery and from other interventions. And so it's really important. And I'll give you an example. During COVID, when so many of us were cooped up at home, one of the big decisions that we were wrestling with for our family was whether or not we should move, right? We live in a small footprint home in the center of a city. Our schools were closed. Our kids were zooming into remote school from our dining room table. And as we were kind of circling around this question of staying in the city or moving to the suburbs, we found that actually when we got out, we went hiking as a family, because that was one of the few activities that were still available to us at that time, right? There were a couple of things. One, we could think more expansively because we didn't have walls surrounding us, unlike the rest of the time when we were all cooped up. Two, we were walking side by side. And as you're having vulnerable conversations, intimate conversations, where you're talking about hopes and dreams, there was something that felt safer, even with someone who I love and I trust and I've spent many years with, where you're sharing that, not looking deeply into each other's eyes, but kind of side by side, looking at the same view together. And that enabled us to share things with each other that we hadn't shared before, talking about whether the jobs that we were in at the time were the ones that we wanted to be in for the foreseeable future, which had a big impact on financially, what would we be able to afford. And it's kind of like why your kids will tell you things when you're driving them somewhere versus when you're staring at them across the table. It's because there's that safety in sharing something when you're not looking deeply into their eyes. And so those are the types of conversations that we felt we were best able to have on hikes when we were out of the chaos of our everyday lives, and that spaciousness served us for the type of conversations we were having.
I love that idea. Sitting next to each other is a strategy and negotiation oftentimes rather than sitting across from each other where we might be more oppositional. And I believe there have been some findings. I haven't read them myself, but it was conveyed to me by a professor that we may have better outcomes sitting next to each other when we're trying to negotiate. Another thing, buddy films. All the buddy films are, driving across country, sitting next to each other, going on an expedition together. Ernie and Bert would sit in bed at night on Sesame Street. Hey, Ernie, you Bert. They would be, sorry, that's my best. But I remember,
pretty good.
But I remember thinking about Ernie and Bert in college when my roommate and I, David, this was back when you'd have two twin beds. I hope it's still done this way. And the lights were out and we'd talk about stuff that we wouldn't maybe say if we were sitting across from each other at the dining hall, about our fears, our longings, whatever it might be. And I think that's a really great strategy to go out into nature. Yeah, I love the idea of forest bathing. My 84-year-old mother called me and said, Adam, have you ever heard about this idea of forest bathing? I'm like, yeah, definitely. I talk about my book. It's like, yeah, it really does work. My face, according to my wife, she says it changes in nature for the better. It's a real thing. But I've also heard it said that if you want to have big ideas, if you're creating a TED Talk, one thing you're going to want to do is get those gigantic Post-it notes and put them all over the room and write down your big ideas on the wall. Obviously, on the Post-it notes, these are huge Post-it notes. They're like, 4 by 6 feet. I forget how big they are, but that's what I did for actually for both of them, when I think of it. And I think it's just really important to have a lot of space when you're trying to maximize a big idea. And I love that you and your husband do that. I think it's great. And I would say my wife and I do it as well for out of the box thinking, unless we get sucked in. So let's imagine that a couple really struggles, as so many do, in talking about money. What would be your top tips for them to just get the ball rolling so that they could begin to talk about money more comfortably and more effectively?
Well, one of the things I think helped me be more comfortable talking about money was having permission, because it was part of a class, right? So as part of the course that my husband and I took, we were investigating this question of why couples who live together have higher divorce rates. I know, it's interesting, right? Not intuitive. And this was in 2008. So it was still a practice that lots of people were cohabitating. The rents were not quite as astronomical as they are now, and there were fewer people doing it. And so we were trying to understand what was the difference between couples that lived together before marriage successfully and other ones who lived together and got divorced ultimately. And because we were investigating this for our final paper and we had a class, it was more comfortable for us to talk to each other about money. It was kind of sanctioned, right, if you will. And so I like to say, blame the book, read Money and Love, and say, hey, I'm reading this book and this author, I heard a podcast where this author was encouraging us to have money conversations. And it's something that we haven't been able to do successfully, or we always get into fights. And each chapter of our book has some questions, some exercises that you can do. And the one talking about 4 big topics to talk about, one of them is money, has some interesting questions like, what is something you like to spend ridiculous amounts of money on, right? Which is a fun question, right? I remember talking about that to my husband, and mine is travel and his is technology, and it's actually still the same all these years later. And tell me some of your earliest money memories, right? These are questions that you're not talking about, well, why was the heating bill so much last month? Or why are you spending that much at the grocery store? But you're kind of unpacking so much of the baggage that we all carry, whether we acknowledge it or not, from the way we were raised to the way that we saw our parents deal with money. And you're sort of getting that out on the table, not because you think that that's going to be the solution, but because it kind of de-risks it, right? Once you start to have the conversation and you realize, oh, okay, we talked about money and we didn't get into a fight, or I learned something about you. I think as long as you go first, if you're with somebody who it's like, I don't want to talk about money, or like, you know what, just humor me. This is something that I was listening to this podcast, I heard about it. What's something you like to spend obscene amounts of money on? We don't always look at each other's credit card bills. So tell me, what was the thing that you spent the most amount of money on last month, right? And so if you're starting to lower the stakes and you're just sort of using money as a currency, if you will, for conversation, it starts to make it less risky. And then you can get into more charged topics, but you first have to start. And the class gave me permission. And so I really hope that this book gives more people permission to go there in their relationships.
I think that what you're doing is so important. I remember there was a couple therapists who had a money and intimacy workshop, and it sounded almost like an oxymoron at the time. And yet it's one of the things that is so important to be able to talk about well and skillfully in the context of couples. And I think it's very predictive of how the relationship qualitatively and quantitatively will proceed. So I think it's a really important thing to get under wraps. Is there anything before I get to my final question that I should have asked but haven't yet asked?
I know you talk about connection, and I think that in addition to knowing what you care about and being able to communicate it with someone else, part of what I think is important for connection is this idea of giving yourself a certain amount of time to make a decision, but then agreeing that that's the decision and you're going to make that right? I think so many people come at this from different ways, just like people have different tendencies with money. Some people have different ways of making decisions, and people who are more gut trusters tend to go with their first instinct, and other people want to analyze things and have spreadsheets. And so sometimes I get, well, what if you're with someone who has a different decision-making style, right? Like, how can you connect with that person if you're just coming at it from different directions? And one of the reasons we think the 5 C's is so powerful is it gives you a shared approach and a shared way to say, listen, I know, and we have a quiz on our website to give you a sense of what type of decision maker you are. So you can go to moneylovebook.com and try it out for yourself. But you probably have a guess of what your partner is and what you might be. And one of the things the 5 C's does is, if you're a gut truster, it gives you a way to make sure you're turning over the right rocks. If you're someone who likes to overanalyze things, analyze things so much that you tend to overanalyze things, it gives you an ability to say, okay, I'm going to go through these 5 steps. And yes, they're iterative, but I'm not going to like go through 5 or 6 iterations of this. I'm going to do this once, and then I'm going to force myself to make a decision. And so I think that it's a way for people who have different styles to connect over a shared approach that then they can agree on. Once we've made this decision, we're now going to make this decision right and not second guess ourselves.
I love that. As Guy Kawasaki says, don't necessarily focus on making the right decision, but focus on making the decision right. And need I even suggest to your listener that there could be anything less sexy than logjam in relationship? So one of the things that you and Myra are so skillfully doing are providing more than just about money, but about all of the implications of various decisions that relate to money, including to have children, not to not have children, where to live, whether to rent or not to rent, to change jobs or to not change jobs. You go through so many of the simulations that relate to life and walk the reader through these simulations in a way that allows them to be prepared and to use the best parts of their brain as they attend to these really important matters of life. So I'm just really grateful to both of you for creating this. And that said, I'm going to, for the sake of time, although I could talk to you for, so much longer, my final question, that is, Abby, if you had the capacity to confer upon all humanity one insight or skill that would dramatically improve the lives of the individual, but since we're all connected, the people around that individual as well, what insight or skill would you wish for that person? And how do you imagine it would impact the individual as well as perhaps the people around that individual?
Well, we just talked about the importance of clarification, right? So I think that the insight of self-knowledge and self-awareness is so empowering to be able to say, I know who I am, I know what's important to me, and therefore I'm not going to worry about the achievements that I see others achieving because that's not what I want for myself. Or now that self-awareness, be a better communicator to the people around me because I know what I want and not so caught up in, again, these mimetic desires. So that's what I would have, is the self-awareness and the self-reflection to know your values.
I love that. To thine own else. Does it go from
To thine own self be true?
To thine own self be true. Yeah. And so many others, including ancient Greek philosophers and modern psychologists, would concur. Beautifully said. I loved the way you rendered that, Abby. And so grateful to you for taking some of your own time and many heartbeats to write this book with your amazing co-author, Myra. And thanks so much for sharing your wisdom with my listeners.
Thank you so much for having me. I loved our conversation.
This is Dr. Adam Dorsay thanking you for listening to SuperPsyched. If you know anyone who might like it or who might benefit from listening, share it. And if you like the episode, please hit subscribe.